Hey guys, tonight we begin with the smell of wood smoke and the hush of snow against an old wooden door. A stillness so deep, even the wind seemed to tiptoe. The kind of cold that doesn't shout, but seeps through the walls, through the seams, through the spaces between your fingers and the last warmth you remember. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Tonight's story takes us to winters long ago. Not in castles or cloisters, but in muddy villages where no one wrote down your name. Where roofs leaked smoke and children wore shoes made of wood. Where winter wasn't a season, but a challenge. A silent guest that stayed too long. You'll meet no kings here. No noble families riding past. Just people hunched near firelight, fingers chapped from wood and wool, whispering hopes into the dark. A mother rubbing warmth into her child's feet. A boy chewing hard bread, saving the crust for his sister. A father rising in the cold to mend a hole in the roof before the snow found it first. They didn't talk much about the cold, because what was the point? Everyone felt it. Everyone carried it. In the bones, in the breath, in the prayers muttered under scratchy blankets. But they had their ways. Quiet ways. Clever ways. A curtain made of sackcloth. A stone warmed in the fire and slipped into bed. A stew that stretched for days. This is a story about survival, not dramatic, but domestic. Not loud, but lasting. And perhaps, as you listen, you'll find the warmth hidden between the words. Because the cold was not just outside. It was inside, too, in the silence, the waiting, the hope. And so was the warmth.so. Pull the blanket up a little tighter. And let's begin. It didn't come with ceremony. There was no trumpet, no warning bell. Just a silence in the grass. A stillness that hadn't been there the night before. The first frost arrived like a whisper, not with snow, but with silver. Silver along the thatch, along the fence posts, along the backs of the goats, still half asleep in their pens. Silver. On the fields, coating the last stubborn cabbages like a warning. They knew what it meant. The frost was not decoration. It was declaration. That the easier half of the year had ended. That warmth would now cost more than it gave. A woman stepped outside and wrapped her shawl tighter, not because she was cold, but because she was remembering. Last winter had taken her brother. The one before had taken the cow. The frost didn't care. It came anyway. Inside, her husband stirred the coals with a stick worn soft at the handle. They hadn't let the fire die completely, but it was thin and ember more than a blaze. The baby slept by the hearth, wrapped into cloaks stitched together from pieces of others. Nothing matched, but it was warm enough. For now, in the loft above, the eldest son pressed his thumb to the wooden wall and found it damp. Not with water, with air, cold air. He pulled the straw tighter around his shoulders and listened to the house breathe. A creak, a crack, a sigh. Winter had begun. The animals felt it too. The pigs were quieter. The chickens reluctant. Even the dog, usually first to rise, stayed curled, nose buried under his tail, dreaming of something warmer. There would be no more barefoot mornings. From now on, every step would come with layers wool on wool, if they had it. Sackcloth. And stitched leather if they didn't. The fields, once soft with autumn rain, had hardened overnight. What wasn't harvested was now lost frozen solid into the earth. A spade would break before the soil did. And so they stopped trying. In the village. A few doors opened. A few people stepped out. They didn't greet each other. No one needed to. The frost was greeting enough. The baker's wife lit the oven with kindling she'd saved from the last market day, brittle twigs from under her cart. The bread would take longer to rise now. The air was colder, the yeast slower. She hummed. A song her mother used to sing mostly to keep her fingers moving. Down the lane, an old man cracked the ice in the water barrel with a stick. Then a rock. Then his heel. When it gave, it cracked like glass, a sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet morning. A girl watched her breath rise in front of her like a spirit. She whispered something into it, a wish, maybe, and watched. It drift upward. She didn't smile. But she didn't cry either. This was just the beginning. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. There was much to do. The first frost was not an event, it was a summons. To gather, to seal, to wrap, to brace. Windows were stuffed with rags. Cracks in walls were patched with mud or manure, not because it looked good, but because it worked. Beauty was a summer. Concern, the last apples were checked, sorted by feel, not sight. Soft meant spoiling. Hard meant hope. The cellar beneath the house, once ignored, was now the most visited room. Everything precious was hidden down there: food, tools, and sometimes even people. A boy carried a bucket from the barn, his breath sharp in the air. Halfway to the cottage, he stopped just to listen. To the quiet. To the frost settling in. Even the birds had hushed. Only the crows remained, not because they were brave, but because they were used to the cold. They perched like sentinels on the fence posts, waiting for weakness. Back inside, the fire was growing. Not large, but steady. The woman fed it one stick at a time, careful not to waste. The sound of it crackling was the only music in the house. The baby stirred, then settled. A good sign. They wouldn't need to warm stones for the cradle, yet at the edge of the village, a shepherd watched his flock from the shadow of an old wall. He'd counted them twice already. He would count them again. Winter liked to steal what you forgot. To check as the sun rose slow and pale, the frost began to melt. Not fast, not completely, just enough to remind them that the day was here, but not enough to make it easy, and so they moved. They swept the frost from the doorstep. They fed the fire again. They began the slow dance of endurance, one foot after the other, one breath at a time, because the frost had fallen. And everything now must be done with care. There was always smoke. Not the clean kind, not the kind that drifted upward and disappeared into the sky. This smoke lingered low, thick, and stubborn. It wrapped around beams, clung to skin, and slept in the rafters like a second roof. You didn't notice it after a while. The sting in your eyes, the scratch in your throat, they just became part of morning. Like the chill in your sleeves, or the ache in your knees. You breathed it in and called it warmth. Most homes had no chimney, not really. Just a hole in the roof, a guess at where the smoke might want to go. Sometimes it listened. Often it didn't. So the fire burned, and the smoke stayed. It painted the ceilings black. Soft black. Charcoal black. The kind of black that told you someone had lived here a long, long time. It hid the cobwebs and the old axe marks. It covered the places where the roof had once leaked, and it preserved things. The meats hanging from the beams, the garlic strung in loose braids, the herbs bundled with fraying twine, all took on that smoky perfume. It was more than flavor. It was survival. The straw beneath their feet told a different story. Laid thick on dirt floors, it served as a kind of bedding for the house itself. It absorbed the cold, the spills, the sleep. When you walked on it, it whispered. Children crawled across it. Dogs found corners of it to curl into. Mice tunneled through it, always a few steps ahead of the broom. And when it got too dirty, which it always did, they added more. Not removed, just layered. Filth made for better insulation. The straw grew heavier with each week of winter. Wetter. Muddier. It smelled of fire, feet, and old soup. But it kept your bones off the frozen earth. And that, in the end, was enough. In some homes, the straw reached ankle high, a silent record of days past. If you listened closely, it crackled underfoot, as if remembering each moment it had warmed. Babies were laid in straw-lined cradles, not for luxury, but because the straw was softer than the boards and warmer than cloth alone. Mothers tucked bits of it under the baby's neck, then rubbed their own hands together for heat. When someone coughed, it echoed against the straw, muffled and low. When someone cried, it soaked in the tears. The straw didn't judge. It absorbed. The smoke drifted through it, slowly, like breath over skin. Together, smoke and straw became the smell of winter. Not just the scent of a home, the scent of staying alive. Some families lit their fires not in hearths, but in fireboxes sunk into the floor. The heat had to rise. But so did the smoke. It filled the house in layers. Children breathed the cleanest air, lowest to the ground. Adults walked through a haze. The elderly sat near the door, where the draft might offer some relief or speed their cough. Clothes hung from rafters to dry and soaked in the smoke. Blankets, too. Even bread, left too close to the fire, came out tasting faintly of soot. But it was better than mold. Better than nothing. By evening, the smoke turned golden in the candlelight. A soft glow, like dust caught in amber. Shadows danced through it, blurring outlines and softening faces. Everyone looked gentler in smoke. The straw, by night, was stirred, gently rearranged by feet finding warmth, bodies shifting in sleep. It rustled like dry leaves, like memory. It held the shape of those who'd lain in it before. When visitors came, they stamped the snow from their boots, then walked in circles to find a clean patch. There wasn't one, but no one said anything. It was rude to point out survival. They'd sit by the fire, eyes watering, coughing once or twice. Then they'd lean in and talk about the weather, about the wolves, about the baby's cough. Everything important was shared in smoke, and if a story was told, even a quiet one, the children listened from the straw. The smoke curled above them, soft and slow, a lullaby with no melody. A presence. Oh, wait. A kind of warmth that didn't need to touch you to be felt. In the darkest part of night, the fire would settle. The room would dim. The smoke would lower again, hanging just above the straw, like a veil. A man would wake to tend the fire, coughing, rubbing his face, eyes half shut. He would add a log, maybe two if it was especially cold. Then he'd sit there a moment, watching the smoke rise again. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar. And familiarity is its own kind of comfort. So he'd breathe it in this thick air, this heated haze. He'd let it coat his lungs like another blanket. And then, quietly, he'd lie back down. The fire still crackled. The straw still whispered. The smoke still held the ceiling like a prayer, and so the night continued, wrapped in warmth made from wood and waste, ash and effort. A warmth they never called beautiful, but one they trusted more than spring. The blanket was never enough. No matter how tightly it was tucked, no matter how many layers lay beneath it, the cold still found a way in. It crept in like doubt, slow and certain, settling in the spaces where warmth had only just been. A quiet kind of cruelty, one that didn't shout, just stayed. Blankets were not the thick, weighty comforts of today. They were stitched from scraps, patched from wool too coarse to sell, lined with the softest rags a household could spare. Some had holes. Most had smells. All had history. A child pulling a blanket to their chin might feel the rough seam where a sleeve once was, might trace a frayed edge with their fingers and wonder which cousin, which grandmother, which sheep had come before. Warmth, when it came, was shared, passed down through both blood and fabric. A tea night, bodies huddled close. Not for affection, though there was that too, sometimes, but for necessity. A mother's back pressed to her daughter's knees. A father's arms around both, not out of sentiment, but insulation. Love was measured in breadth and proximity. The bed wasn't always a bed. Sometimes it was just straw piled high, or a wooden bench softened by age. In the best homes, a mattress of feathers. In the rest, sacks filled with chaff. Either way, the cold sank down, and never truly left, and so they curled. They curved themselves into the smallest shapes they could manage. Limbs tucked, shoulders hunched, noses hidden beneath cloth. They learned the art of sleeping without moving lest the blanket shift and invite the air in again. Children often slept three to a bed, and not always in the same direction. Feet at heads, heads at feet. A tangle of dreams and elbows and whispered complaints. But warmth has no manners. It only has motive. Wool was the finest armor against the night, but it came at a price. It itched. It scratched. It clung like guilt, and once damp, it turned on you, holding the cold and like a sponge. Still, they wore it. Layers upon layers. Even to bed. A tunic, then a second. Socks stuffed with hay. Mittens that had once been sleeves. A bonnet tied too tight, just to keep the heat from escaping through the scalp. Heat was always escaping. It drifted upward, lured by cracks in the roof or gaps in the wall. You could almost see it leaving like breath in the dark, like regret. And the cold, like any opportunist, filled the space left behind. Sometimes a warm stone was placed under the blanket, heated in the fire, wrapped in cloth, then nestled near the feet. It gave off heat for a short while and a strange, comforting smell of smoke and linen. By morning, it was cold again. But for a few hours, it made the bed feel like mercy. Some families slept with animals in the room, not just out of kindness, but because a cow gave off more heat than 3 blankets. The warmth of breath, the soft bulk of fur, the steady, rhythmic sound of something living beside you. These were the lullabies of winter. Dot and a one talked much before bed. Voices seemed louder in the dark. Instead, they communicated in sighs, in the shuffle of feet, in the rustle of blankets being lifted and settled. A mother might hum softly, but only for a moment. A father might murmur a prayer not aloud, but beneath his breath. It was better not to disturb the hush, because the hush was delicate, like the layer of warmth you worked all day to build. When someone stirred at night, it woke the whole room. The cold followed them like a shadow. They would return quickly, clutching a child who'd wet the bed, or fetching more wood for the fire. And then there would be a brief flurry of movement. Blankets lifted, limbs rearranged, a new position, carved out of the shared heat. Sometimes someone would shiver hard enough to wake themselves. And for a few long minutes, they'd lie, their eyes open, heart thudding, staring at the dim ceiling beams above. Not because of fear, not because of dreams, but because of the simple, painful awareness of being cold. And yet, there was a kind of closeness in it, a kind of unity, to know that every cough, every sigh, every tug of the blanket had meaning, that you are part of something not warm, perhaps, but not alone either. In the morning, they emerged slowly. The blankets were reluctant to release them. Hair stuck out in strange directions. Feet hit the cold floor like a curse. But no one complained much. Complaints used energy. And energy was warmth. The blankets were folded or shaken or left exactly as they were. Some held on to heat for a few moments longer. Others touched, felt as cold as the ground, as though they had never been warm at all, and yet each night they returned to them. Not because they expected comfort, but because it was what they had. Because, under those patched layers the itchy wool and sleeping breath, was a place that tried in its own stubborn way to be home. There was always bread, or the idea of it. Even in the leanest homes, even in the coldest months, bread lingered as both memory and goal. Not soft, not fresh, not warm from the oven, but dense, dry, and waiting. A comfort shaped into a crust dot in winter. Bread changed. Gone were the golden loaves of harvest, the warm slabs eaten straight from the baking stone. What remained was darker, harder, heavier. It sat like a stone in the belly, and that was the point. Each loaf had a story behind it, not of wheat fields and bounty, but of choices made under pressure. To grind the barley instead of the rye, to stretch the flour with acorn meal or mashed beans, to bake on a hearthstone still warm from the last fire. Because wood was low and patience was thinner than dough, there were no exact recipes, only instincts. A handful of this, a splash of that, a pinch of salt if there was salt to spare. Dough kneaded by hands already cracked from cold, left to rise in a room where rising was a challenge. The dough never rose much. The air was too cold. Sometimes it sat for hours without changing, stubborn as the season. And when finally baked, the bread came out flat and hard but firm, filling and impossible to waste. Each loaf was guarded like gold, wrapped in cloth, hidden from mice, rationed by weight and whim. The children were warned not too much at once. Chew slowly. Let it last. This bread was meant to endure. Some families kept a bread shelf, a cool, high ledge near the hearth. Not for display, but for preservation. There, the loaves grew stale in peace. Hard bread could be softened with soup, but spoiled bread, that was betrayal. Sometimes mold crept in. Blue patches on the crust, a softness where it shouldn't be. It was scraped off with a knife. The rest of the loaf deemed good enough, and it was. Because to throw it away would feel like throwing away effort, hope, time. The crusts were the hardest part, almost inedible at times. But they were dipped in broth, in water, in the last bit of animal fat scraped from a pan. They were softened. Between palms and fed to the smallest mouths first. A child might gnaw on a hunk of bread all afternoon, not as a snack, but as a task. Each bite worked down slowly, teeth pressing through resistance, tongue catching every flake. On feast days rare, radiant, the bread might be better, thicker, baked longer, maybe with a brush of oil or a handful of herbs folded in. Not enough to make it rich, but enough to make it memorable. There were sayings about bread. Bread never lies. Bread keeps secrets. Bread is work, and bread is worth. Every village had its wisdom, wrapped in crust, and every home had someone who baked. Often a woman. Often the same hands that chopped wood, cleaned wounds, soothed children, scrubbed pots. She'd dust her fingers with flour like it was a kind of magic, turning grain into survival if the oven was communal. She'd walk to it early, a cloth over her bowl, breath puffing into the dark. She'd trade words with others, barely audible, while loaves baked in silence. The smell would drift before they did. And for a few minutes, the cold seemed less cruel. Bread didn't just feed the body. It marked the days. A loaf baked meant Another day done. Another meal prepared. Another reason to stay up just long enough to cool it, to slice it, to store it. Sometimes the bread cracked while baking, split down the center like an old road. It wasn't a flaw. It was a story that something strong had tried to grow inside it. And had bread held silence well, you could eat it without speaking. You could break it and pass it without a word. It soaked up grief. It caught crumbs of joy in the darkest nights. When the stew was thin and the fire low, bread became the anchor. Rationed into careful halves, then smaller. Fingers breaking off pieces for children. A parent pretending they weren't hungry, but even then, even in the hush of cold and hunger, bread remained sacred. You didn't curse the loaf, no matter how stale. You didn't waste the heel, because it had come from labor, from fire, from ground grain and bent backs, and because tomorrow's loaf wasn't promised. So they wrapped what was left in cloth, tucked it near the fire, whispered a blessing, and closed their eyes. And in that act, small, slow, and soft, they found a kind of peace. The bread would be there in the morning. And so they hoped. Would they? There was a heaviness to the air, not just from the cold, but from the knowing. The season had come. Not marked by stars or saints, but by the sound of knives being sharpened and barns going quiet. They called it slaughter season. A phrase spoken plainly, without ceremony. Because this was not a festival. It was a necessity. The animals had been fed through summer, fattened through fall. But winter didn't forgive waste. You could not feed what could not feed you back. The pigs were always first. Not because they were least loved, but because they gave the most. Meat, fat, bone, bristle, nothing was discarded. Even the squeal, sharp and short, became part of the memory. It began before dawn. A man and a boy walking to the pen. Quiet steps. No speaking. The pig, sensing something, shifted in its sleep. There was no cruelty in it. Only resolve. Only cold fingers gripping rope, steady hands pressing the blade. The animal died quickly or quickly enough. No one lingered. The blood steamed in. The frost. The snow soaked it in like ink. The body was hauled to a beam and strung up by its feet. A familiar ritual, as old as the house itself. Older, maybe, inside. Water was boiled. Knives were laid out on wood, scarred from years of the same. Work. The smell was metallic, sharp, immediate. The steam from the pot mingled with the breath of those watching. Children weren't always sent away. Not out of harshness, but out of honesty. They would live through many winters. They would need to know how to survive them. The pig was opened. Carefully, methodically. Organs placed into bowls, then jars, then pots. The best parts saved. The strange parts transformed. Sausages were made the same day, hung from beams above the hearth like plump garlands. Fat was rendered into lard, a treasure, white as snow and far more precious. Bones were cracked for marrow. Nothing absolutely. Nothing was wasted. The same hands that spun wool and mended boots now salted meat, turned skins, and stirred blood into pudding. This wasn't men's work or women's work. It was winter's work, and the house smelled different 4 days after. Not unpleasant, just real. Like salt and iron, like smoke and effort, the first meal after slaughter was always quiet. The stew, darker, the broth richer. A slice of meat passed gently to each child, as though it might vanish if handled too quickly. They chewed slower, not because they were told to, but because they understood. This was the meat that would carry them through February. This was the animal they had fed, touched, and now tasted, and even if they didn't say thank you, they remembered. In the way they didn't waste a bite. In the way they cleaned the bowl with the last crust of bread. In the way their mother sat a moment longer by the pot, eyes closed, spoon in hand. Other animals followed a goat, sometimes, or an old hen who no longer laid. Their passings were quieter, their yields smaller, but each offered something. A few meals, a few bones. A bit more time. The cold helped. The meat didn't spoil, not quickly. It could be packed in snow, stored in cellars, hung from beams, wrapped in cloth. The air itself became a preservative, a partner in the process. Still, there were risks. If the salt ran low, if the firewood ran out before the rendering finished, if a rat found the wrong corner of the shed. The winter was long, and anything lost was not easily replaced, and so they watched, checked, counted. A boy might be sent out to inspect the barrels, to make sure the brine still covered the meat. A girl might sniff the air for soreness, or help stir the drying herbs to keep away mold. Every day, the memory of that first slaughter echoed not just in the pantry, but in the mind. It was the sound of getting ready, of doing what had to be done, of facing the hunger before it arrived, because winter asked questions long before it knocked. And those who didn't answer early often didn't answer at all. So the meat was salted, wrapped, strung, buried, boiled, stored. It became part of the rhythm of December, just as necessary as fire, bread, or prayer. In the evenings, when the family gathered by the hearth, they might eat a sliver of pork on a piece of hard bread. They might sip the broth left from the bones. They might speak of nothing at all, but somewhere, under the floorboards or above the rafters, hung the proof of their labor, the quiet promise that, for now, they had enough, and that in a world where so little was certain was a kind of peace. A tea was a strange kind of silence, not the hush of snowfall or the breathless pause before dawn. This silence had bubbles in it, or once did. The ale had frozen. It started with a sound, or the lack of one. The daily slosh in the barrel, the comforting glug as the ladle dipped in, had turned to a thick, dull scrape. Cold had crept in during the night, and now the drink that once softened everything had stiffened like sorrow. Ale was never just ale. It was the thing between hunger and hope, between waking and sleeping, between too much and not enough water. Was dangerous. It carried more than thirst could handle. But ale, even weak and warm, was trusted. Made in barrels, passed down through families, brewed with herbs, honey, oats, or rye, whatever the year had left behind. Children drank it. Elders blessed it. It was bread you could sip. Bitter sometimes, cloudy always. And when it was cold enough to freeze, you knew the season had turned. The barrels were kept near the fire, but space was tight. A good seat by the hearth meant warmth for people, not for drink. And so the ale sat in corners, cloaked in cloth. Like a quiet old friend trying not to be a burden, some tried to chip at the frozen crust with spoons or sticks. Others wrapped the barrels in wool, muttering about how it never used to get this cold. But cold didn't care. Cold crept through wool, through wood, through walls built by better hands long ago. A boy once tapped the side of the ale cask and pressed his ear to it. He said it sounded like someone asleep. His sister asked if it dreamed. He didn't answer. When the ale froze, mealtimes changed. There was no drink to warm the belly, no soft buzz to ease the sting of an empty stew pot. Conversation slowed. Laughter dulled. The cold didn't just take the ale, it took the ease, but they adapted. They always did. Sometimes the frozen top would be carved out like a crust, the softer liquid beneath ladled with care. Other times they would melt a chunk near the fire and pass it around in mugs so warm They steamed in shaking hands on rare days. Someone might stir dried herbs into the warmed ale thyme if it was still fresh. Juniper, if they were lucky. It helped, not with hunger, but with memory, because the ale held stories. Not grand ones, not tales of kings or crusades, but the smaller kind of marriages toasted, of babies born in spring, of songs sung too loudly around the fire. When the barrel was full, so were they, and when it froze, it felt like forgetting. Still, the rituals remained. The ladle hung on its hook. The mugs stayed close to the fire. Someone always checked the barrel in the morning, pressing a hand to the side, hopeful. There was a kind of comfort in the checking, even if the answer was the same. Sometimes neighbors came with jars, asking if theirs had spoiled. They traded sips, faces squinting with each taste. Not for pleasure, but for survival. Bad ale could sicken. Frozen ale could disappear. And no one could afford either. When a new batch was brewed in winter, it was done carefully. The room was closed tight. The fire kept steady, each bubbling. Sound in the pot was a promise. Each sniff of the mash was a reminder. We're still making something. The brewer was treated with a certain reverence. Not as a priest, not quite, but close. They worked quietly, head bowed, hands knowing. And when the ale was poured dark, cloudy, barely warm, it was met with gratitude. Not applause, not praise, just a long sip. A longer exhale dot in the darkest weeks, when the wind scratched at the windows and the sky forgot to turn blue. The ale was passed around like a shared thought. One mug, one fire, and enough silence to let it matter. The elders would nod. The children would giggle from the bitterness. The middle-aged would look at their hands and think about spring, because ale, even frozen, was a kind of hope, not loud, not bright, just quiet, bitter, and made from scraps. And when the barrel gave its last sigh, when the final drop was ladled and swallowed, someone always whispered, "There'll be more." Not because they knew, but because they had to believe it. Children didn't understand winter the same way adults did. To them, it came not with dread, but with wonder, at least at first. The glitter of frost on a windowsill, the strange stillness of the air, the way their breath became visible like a secret finally shown. It was magic, until it wasn't. They felt the cold differently, more sharply in their fingers, more playfully in their cheeks, but also more quietly in their hunger, more loudly in their sleep. Winter shrank the world. The fields were no longer for running. The creek, now sealed in silence, could not splash back. Even the woods were forbidden wolves, they were told. Spirits, they imagined. Play moved indoors. If space allowed, they turned corners of the cottage into kingdoms. Blankets became castles. Pots became drums. Laughter still came, bright and short, echoing through beams darkened with soot, but laughter was warmth, and warmth was watched. A mother might hush them with a gentle hand, not for mischief, but to save energy. Every noise carried effort. Every outburst let the cold in. They rose early like everyone. No sleeping, and not in winter. There were ashes to be swept, animals to check, buckets to fill. Chores weren't called chores. They were called life. Tiny fingers broke the ice on the water pail, flinching. Small feet slipped into stiff boots, still damp from the day before. Sometimes they cried without sound, just the scrunched face and bitten lip. But someone always noticed, and someone always helped. They learned quickly that fire needed feeding, not just with wood, but with vigilance. A boy might poke at coals the way others poked at games. A girl might stir porridge like she was conjuring something bigger than food. There were lessons in silence. How to layer wool in the right order. How to warm hands by pressing them to a sibling's neck. How to chew slowly, to feel full longer. And yet, winter brought its own joys. The first snowfall was always greeted with awe. They pressed their faces to cold glass, whispered wishes into mittens, caught flakes on tongues already cracked with cold. It didn't matter that the snow would mean more labor, more freezing, more work. For a moment, it was beautiful. Snow meant stories. Not from books there were few, but from mouths older than memory. Around the fire, someone would begin, long ago when the snow came this early. And the children would lean in, knees pulled to chests, ears wide as pots. They lived for the part where something magical happened, or something terrible, or sometimes both. They asked questions, endless ones. Why do the trees crack at night? Can wolves speak to each other in dreams? Does the frost know our names? Most answers were half-truths, wrapped in warmth. Because in winter, truth was best served with softness. Some toys survived the season. Wooden dolls with fading paint. A ball made from bundled rags. One boy had a whistle carved from bone. He never played it indoors. Out of respect, or fear, or both, their dreams were vivid. Not of summer, but of food. Of bread thicker than fists. Of jam that never ran out. Of honey eaten with fingers and no one scolding. And sometimes, when the hunger stirred too sharply, a mother would stroke her child's hair and speak of spring. Of baby lambs and warm sun and days long enough to forget the night. They needed to hear it. And she needed to say it. Illness came quickly to children. Coughs that deepened too fast. Fevers that startled in the night. They were watched with the intensity of prayer. A hand to the forehead. A bowl of steeped herbs. A whispered song. When one got better, it was celebrated with silence, the kind of silence that wraps around relief like a quilt. When one didn't, the straw was changed. The blanket washed. The name whispered less often, but most made it through. Somehow, they grew stronger with each season, their memories layered like clothes in a trunk. A winter of mice in the flour bin. A winter when the roof gave in. A winter when the bread rose higher than expected, and they laughed for hours over nothing at all. And always, there was the candle. That one little flame at night, dancing on the table. Its flicker meant safety. Its light meant the day had ended, and they were still here. They would stare at it until their eyes fluttered. And then they'd curl under blankets, tangled with each other, wrapped in stories and smoke. Winter, to them, was both enemy and enchantment. It shaped them, humbled them, taught them that warmth came not from the fire, but from the nearness of others. And when they finally slept, it was with limbs heavy from labor and hearts still open to dreams. Dreams of green things, of long days, of noise. The fire was not just a fire. It was breath. It was boundary. It was the heartbeat of the home. Not bright and leaping that was for stories and memories. This fire was slow, careful, necessary. It rarely roared. It murmured, crackled, hissed softly like someone breathing in sleep. Keeping the fire alive was not a task. It was a calling. You didn't forget it any more than you forgot to blink. A single ember could mean the difference between warmth and warning. Because once the fire died, starting it again was not simple. No matches, no lighter, just flint and patience. And hands too cold for either. So someone always watched it. Always. Even in sleep, ears listened for the change in tone, the shift from burning to cooling, from life to loss. A child might wake and prod the ashes. A mother might turn in her blanket and whisper, add another stick. Wood was rationed like gold. You didn't burn a log unless you had to. Twigs, straw, dry dung all offered up first. Logs came later, when the frost made promises it wouldn't break. There was a rhythm to feeding the fire. A log at dawn, a branch mid-morning, ashes stirred before supper. A coal nestled under more straw. As night drew near, the ashes themselves were sacred. Not waste, but memory. Soft gray powder that kept the heat sleeping beneath it. When stirred gently, the glow returned reluctant but faithful. Children learned early to recognize the color of good coals. Not orange, not red, but the soft dull blush of something holding on. They knew how to blow just right. Not too hard, not too fast. Like waking someone gently, sometimes the fire was buried before sleep, covered in ash to smother the light, protect the heat. It looked dead, but in the morning, with the right touch, it would blink open again. There were days when it refused, when cold had crept in too deep. Then came the ritual. Flint struck against steel, a prayer beneath the breath. Dry moss coaxed like an animal not yet tamed. Failure meant a house full of breath that curled in the air. Meant fingers stiff before breakfast. Meant silence not peaceful, but heavy. Neighbors helped sometimes. Passing a coal on a shovel. Walking it wrapped in wool from one door to another like a blessing. Because warmth, like bread, was something to be shared before it was asked for. The hearth was more than a place for cooking. It was the room's anchor. Around it they ate. Beside it they stitched. Above it they dried herbs, sausages, shoes, and in front of it they spoke. Not always loudly, but with the kind of words that mean more when backs are turned and hands are busy. The fire made space for that kind of honesty. On the worst nights, someone sat beside it the whole time, eyes half shut, feet tucked close, listening to the wind. Scratched the shutters, daring it to come in, and the fire answered. With pops, sighs, little flares of light. Like a storyteller too old to leave the house, but too proud to be forgotten. In the morning, before the light came in, the fire was tested. A hand hovered above the coals, not touching, but close enough to feel. If there was warmth, there was hope. If not, there was work to do, even after meals, even after songs. The last act of every night was for the fire. Stir the ash. Add one more twig. Check the damp cloth by the side, the stack of kindling, the empty place where logs should be. There were those who believed the fire knew them, that it changed with the mood of the house, that it hissed more when tempers rose, that it flared bright when someone laughed unexpectedly. Maybe it did. Or maybe we only see magic in the things we cannot live without. By the end of winter, the fire had burned through more than wood, through silence, through grief, through long hours when nothing else worked but the flame. It had kept babies breathing, kept mothers cooking, kept men from freezing after a day in the field with nothing but a patched cloak and stubbornness. It had cracked stones and scorched pots and left shadows that never quite left the wall. But it had stayed, because they had stayed with it. A fire, like a family, doesn't ask to be fed only when it's hungry. It asks always, and it gives only what it gets. So they fed it, with wood, with time, with quiet attention. And in return, it told them slowly, softly, that they were not alone in the dark. The cough began quietly, a tickle in the throat, a breath held too long. Someone cleared it into their sleeve, thinking little of it. But winter listens closely, and soon the cough echoed, from child to mother, from father to neighbor. The house held it in its beams, in its straw, in the soft, smothered hush of the nights. Illness didn't need an invitation. It slipped in through the cracks, rode in on the frost, settled in lungs, the way snow settled on rooftops gently, then suddenly, then heavily dot. It didn't shout. It whispered. A fever that crept rather than flared. A chill that no blanket could reason with. When someone fell ill, the rhythm of the house changed. The pot boiled longer. The silence deepened. The straw was shifted to make a softer place. People moved with more care, not out of panic, but out of respect. There were no doctors. Only hands. Only herbs. Only hope. A mother might brew elderflower, or steep thyme and honey, if the bees had given enough that year. If not, warm water would do. Warmth was its own kind of medicine, a gentle one. If not always enough, the sick were watched like embers, not too close, not too far. A touch to the forehead. A cloth wrung in water. A whispered, "Stay with us," even if no one said it aloud. Sometimes the sick talked in their sleep. Names, memories, things no one else understood. Children called out for warmth that wasn't there. Old men muttered about summers long past. The room became smaller when illness entered. Not physically, but emotionally. The fire burned a little hotter, though no one added extra wood. The air thickened with prayers not voiced, and still, chores continued. The goats needed feeding. The ice in the barrel had to be broken. Bread had to be made, even if hands shook and eyes burned, because winter didn't wait for recovery. It didn't pause while someone rested. It marched on through sleet, through storm, through sickness. Sometimes illness passed, quietly, like it had come. A cough that faded, a fever that broke before dawn. The patient sat up slowly, dazed and blinking, as though returning from a far country. There was no celebration, just a bowl of broth, a nod, and a return to the work of staying alive. But not always. Sometimes the blanket stayed still. The breath did not return. The cough stopped, and the silence that followed was not the peaceful kind. Then the house truly went quiet. Even the fire seemed to burn lower. There were rituals for death, simple, spare, old. The body washed with warm cloths. A prayer whispered over closed eyes. Straw replaced beneath them, not just for comfort, but for dignity. The rest of the family carried on because they had to. The living are always busy. Children asked questions. Did he freeze? Will she come back in the spring? And parents gave answers wrapped in gentleness and half-truths. She's resting now. He's gone to the warm place. We'll light a candle for him tonight. And they did. Even if the tallow was low, even if the room was cold. A candle was lit, its flame not large but steady. A reminder that warmth remained. Illness didn't make them weaker. It made them quieter, more careful, more connected. They watched each other more closely. Offered the last of the broth to the one with the sore throat. Let the old man sleep nearer to the fire. Shared fewer words but more glances, and when one recovered, there was relief. Not joy. Winter didn't allow for much of that, but something close. A soft exhale, a moment of stillness, a longer look into the fire before moving on, because winter illness wasn't just about fevers. It was about memory, about the weight of absence, about the way a house holds onto voices, even when the mouths that made them are gone. Still, they endured, not because they were stronger than the illness, but because they had no choice. Because life continued, quietly and firmly, through coughs, through chills, through loss, and each day, someone rose even with shaking hands, even with red-rimmed eyes. The fire was fed, the bread was made, the warmth was rebuilt, one ember at a time. The cold could be endured, but the itch, The itch was constant. It crawled beneath the sleeves, crept behind the knees, whispered at the neck like a warning. Not pain, exactly, just the steady reminder that you were covered in things. Not made for comfort. Wool, in those days, was no luxury. It was thick, scratchy, unyielding, a defense, not a delight. Spun by hand, washed in hard water, worn until the fibers grew tired, and then worn some more. There were no smooth seams, no soft linings. Every tunic, every shawl, every leg wrapping was a compromise between warmth and torment. But it was a compromise they accepted. Underneath the wool, skin rebelled, chapped and flaking, raw in places no one talked about. Red patches bloomed in silence, not from disease, but from living, from the rub of rough cloth, from the damp that never fully left. Children scratched without thinking. A fingernail up the back, a twist of the wrist to reach the spot just under the collar. Mothers smacked hands away gently. Don't scratch. You'll bleed. But sometimes bleeding was a relief. Because the itch was worse than pain, there were no creams. Only grease saved from the skillet, or tallow rubbed between palms until it softened. Sometimes a bit of honey, if the rash cracked. A smear of ash and water. Old wisdom, passed down in murmurs. At night, the wool came off if they were lucky. If the room was warm enough. If there was no one else to see the marks on the skin, straw stuck to their calves. Sweat froze along their spines. The itch became a ghost that lay with them just behind the shoulder blade, just beyond reach. Washing helped a little. But washing in winter was a battle of its own. The water was boiled, cooled just enough not to burn, then poured from a ladle while someone else held the cloth. You didn't soak. You dabbed. Quickly, carefully, shivering the whole time, and afterward you dried yourself with wool. So the itch returned. Men scratched as they worked under the arm, behind the thigh, under the belt. Women did it with more subtlety. A bend, a press, a soft twist of the fingers beneath a skirt hem. It was everywhere. In the folds of the elbows. In the places where wool bunched and wouldn't breathe. Sometimes, when no one watched, they peeled back their tunic and looked at their own skin. Not out of vanity, out of curiosity. To see what winter had done to them this time. Skin was not soft in winter. It was hardened like the bread, cracked like the earth outside, but still warm, still alive. A baby's skin fared better kept close to the fire, bundled in layers of linen, rubbed gently with fat or old cloths. But even they scratched, fists curled, cheeks red from woolen wraps. No one talked about it much. It wasn't sickness. It wasn't danger. It was simply part of being, part of surviving. The itch taught you restraint. How to endure. How to scratch just enough. How to keep going when everything under your clothes whispered for relief. And there was irony in it, of course. The same wool that saved them from freezing was the wool that irritated their flesh. The same fire that dried their clothes dried their skin. Warmth, like everything else in winter, came with a price, but there were small mercies, a linen underlayer, if you were fortunate. A borrowed cloak that had been washed recently. A brief moment in the sun, even cold sun, with sleeves rolled high and arms stretched wide. They spoke of spring as if it were a balm, when the wool could be set aside, washed with flowers, hung on lines until it forgot its bite, when skin could breathe again, when itching would be replaced by warmth of a different kind, sunlight, not smoke. Until then, they scratched discreetly, rubbed red hands together under tables, pressed cloth to aching spots when no one looked. The wool itched. The skin cracked. And yet, They carried on because the alternative was worse, and in the quiet moments when the fire flickered and the wind pressed against the door, they knew even discomfort could mean safety. Even itching could mean life.so. They wore the wool, and they bore the itch, and they did not complain. Not loudly anyway, because in winter, the body didn't ask for comfort. It asked only to keep going. Some days, the sun simply didn't come. Not really. It rose, yes, somewhere beyond the clouds, beyond the gray. But it never quite arrived. The light stayed dim, pale and cold, like the memory of warmth. It slipped through the shutters in thin ribbons, not gold, not bright just enough to let them see their breath. These were the hardest days. Not because of hunger or even the cold, but because of the weight, of the colorless sky, of the long, shapeless hours. Without sunlight, time felt different. You woke because others did. You worked because the chores didn't stop. But your body moved like it was underwater. The fire burned steadily, but it couldn't chase away the gray. Even its flames seemed paler. Even its warmth seemed reluctant. Outside, the fields looked frozen in thought. Frost clung to every stalk and stone. The trees didn't move. Not a single bird stirred. Inside, people spoke more softly. Not by choice, but by instinct. Their voices felt too loud against the hush. Children sat closer to the hearth. Their games quieter. Their laughter thinner, still present, but cautious, like it didn't want to be scolded by the day. Mothers squinted more while sewing, eyes tired from the flickering light. Fathers missed small things, a crooked nail, a nick in the blade, and said nothing about it. And one complained aloud. They just moved a little slower, took a little longer between tasks, looked out the window more often, hoping for brightness that never came. A day without sunlight made the house feel older. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. Even the furniture sighed when touched. Meals felt more like pauses than events. A hunk of bread, a bowl of gruel, steam rising quickly into the cold, fading before anyone could say grace. And yet, there was something gentle about it too, the softness of the shadows, the way the fire's light flickered more dramatically against the walls, the way a single candle seemed to matter more than usual. There was a sort of reverence in the dim, a hush that encouraged thought, a quiet that brought old songs to the surface. Someone might hum a lullaby no one remembered learning, a tune that didn't need words. The old woman in the corner might tell a story, not loudly, just enough to be heard. A tale of another gray day long ago, a tale where the sun finally returned and the children listened, not for the ending, but for the rhythm, for the cadence of a voice reminding them that days like this had come before and passed. Work didn't stop. The goat still needed milking. The herbs still needed turning. The ashes still needed sweeping, but there were more pauses, more hands wrapped around mugs just to feel something warm, more eyes lingering on the fire as if it might offer answers. Even the animals were subdued. The dog curled deeper into its corner. The chickens didn't venture out. The cow mooed only once, then fell silent, and the wind, when it came, didn't howl. It pressed against the door, against the roof, as if testing the resolve of wood. And will that be why mid-afternoon? It was already dusk. The light shifted almost imperceptibly from pale gray to darker gray. No sunset, no golden hour, just a quiet descent. They lit the candles early, let the fire grow just a bit larger, not because they were cold, though they were, but because they needed the light. Someone fetched the good candle, the one saved for feast days. It was placed in the center of the table, its flame unwavering, and around it they gathered, not to talk, not to eat, just to be. The day without sunlight had asked nothing from them except presence, and they had given it. When sleep came, it came quickly, as though the body, starved for brightness, sought rest instead. Blankets were pulled tight, good nights whispered in half words, and just before the last candle was pinched out, someone whispered, "Tomorrow, maybe." No one answered. But in the silence there was agreement, because even on the grayest day, they believed in the sun. When the sky went black and the last chore was done, something shifted. The house exhaled. The boots were set by the door, the tools wiped clean, and the fire, still glowing, became the room's heartbeat again. It was then, and only then, that the stories came out, not loudly, not with fanfare, but with a candle lit and a voice softened by fatigue. The flame danced in its holder, not a grand torch, just a stub of wax saved from better days. Its flicker cast shadows on the beams overhead, not frightening ones, just familiar, moving. Like old thoughts, they didn't have books. Not most of them. What they had were memories, wrapped in rhythm. Tales passed down like patchwork blankets worn, mended, but always warm. A child would lean into a parent's side, thumb tucked beneath a sleeve. A grandfather would clear his throat, not because he was ready to speak, but because the silence asked him to. Some stories were real, of wolves at the edge of the woods, of winters colder than this one, of a boy who once survived 2 nights in the snow by curling up beside a dying sheep. Others were less certain, of spirits that whispered in the chimneys, of a fox that stole a loaf of bread but left behind a silver coin, of the old stone near the well that was said to cry if touched by someone with an unclean heart. The children didn't ask which were true. They didn't need to. Truth was less important than the telling, than the shape of the words, than the warmth that came from listening. A good story had rhythm. It matched the fire's crackle, the wind's moan outside the shutter. It didn't rush. It wandered, lingered, circled back like the way someone rubbed their own hands for warmth. The best stories weren't always the most dramatic. Sometimes they were about a girl who found a sprig of mint under the snow, or a man who dreamt of summer so vividly that he woke with warmth in his bones. And sometimes they were stories with no ending, just a pause, just a smile, just a look that said, "That's enough for tonight." No one ever clapped. That wasn't the point. But someone would nod slowly. Someone else would sigh softly, and the silence that followed would feel full. Like a well just before it overflows, the candle melted downward as the words drifted out. Children's heads lolled sideways. A girl's fingers uncurled. A boy's mouth opened slightly in sleep, one by one. The listeners faded, not from boredom, from safety, from knowing the story would still be there tomorrow, told again, perhaps differently, perhaps not. The storyteller, often the oldest, sometimes the quietest, would keep speaking a little longer, even after the room was still. Not for the others, for themselves. To remember they had survived this day, that their voice still mattered. Sometimes the stories weren't about people at all. They were about fire or bread or rain. The kinds of things no one wrote down, but everyone carried in their bones. The flame in the candle would gutter, a reminder that wax was finite, but no one rushed to put it out. They let it die naturally, like the end of a good tale, and in that last stretch of glow, faces softened. Wrinkles became stories in themselves, and shadows cast by the flame flickered like memory returning home. By then, the fire was low, the coals orange, the ash thick. But the room was not cold. The The stories had done their work. They had filled the gaps between hunger and hope, between fear and faith. They had made the room warmer than any blanket, because in the long winter, when light was precious and time was long, stories were not luxury. They were necessity, the way to remember, the way to believe. And when the flame finally died, and the house fell into silence, the stories didn't leave. They stayed. In the wood, in the walls, in the people sleeping close to each other, waiting to be told again. When the candle was lit next time, a tea came without sound. No thunder, no wind. Just the slow, deliberate fall of snow, gentle as breath, soft as forgetting. You wouldn't know it at first. Only that the world outside looked different, muted, like someone had pulled a blanket over the earth and whispered, "Hush." The snow didn't shout its arrival. It settled. On rooftops, on fences, on the shoulders of old trees. It softened the edges of everything, even the worries, inside. The cottage, someone would open the shutter, just a crack. Just enough to see the white creeping across the field, blanketing the path, filling the air like fog that decided to land. There was beauty in it, yes. But there was also burden, because snow meant silence, and silence meant stillness. And in winter, stillness was not rest, it was a reminder. That travel would slow, that water would freeze, that food, once gone, would not return easily. Still, no one cursed the snow aloud. They watched it fall and felt its weight, not just on the roof, but on the spirit. A quiet pressure that made you walk slower, speak softer, think longer. A boy might press his face to the cold glass, drawing circles with his breath. A girl might listen for the sound of the flakes hitting the roof and hear nothing. That was the strange thing. Snow was loud in its quiet. You could hear the fire more clearly. You could hear your own steps across the straw, even a cough-in. The next room sounded like a bell. In all that hush, the animals were subdued. Chickens clustered together, feathers fluffed. The goat barely stirred. Even the dog didn't bark, just watched, ears twitching at a world turned white. Sometimes they went outside, wrapped in every layer they owned, mittens stiff with last week's frost. The snow crunched beneath their feet only at first. Then it packed down, tight and cold, and the sound disappeared again. It clung to wool, gathered in boots, snuck into sleeves and refused to melt. Children laughed, then cried because wet fingers led to cold bones, and cold bones led to nothing good. The snow covered the woodpile, and someone had to dig it out. It packed around the door, and someone had to clear a path. Every hour it seemed to fall faster, like the sky was emptying something it had been holding too long. Inside, soup simmered on the fire, thin but hot. Bread was sliced with care. No one ate quickly. No one asked for seconds. Snow days were candle days. Early light, long shadows. Evening came like a curtain drawn too soon, and when it did, they sat closer, not just for warmth, for presence. The snow pressed so thick against the windows, it felt like another wall. You could forget the world beyond your house. You could believe you were alone in the white, and that was frightening sometimes, but also freeing, because if the snow covered everything, the paths, the past, the pain, maybe it also gave permission to pause, to sit, to hold, to sleep. A tea night, the world was silent in a way it never was. No owls, no wind, just snow falling in a darkness that seemed to breathe, and the roof bore its weight. You could hear it, a groan here, a creak there, wood remembering its limits, nails holding on a little longer. But inside, the fire burned steady. The straw held the heat. And in the beds, People curled into one another, like commas in a sentence that didn't need to end. Sometimes snow meant stories. Sometimes snow meant sleep, and sometimes, only sometimes, it meant stepping outside just before dawn. To see the world reshaped. Untouched. Sacred, a single lantern held up in the dark. A face lifted to the flakes. A breath drawn slowly, then let out like a prayer, because in the quiet of snow, nothing felt rushed. Even thoughts moved slower. Even sorrow felt gentler, and though they knew it would melt, that soon the beauty would be mud, and the silence would be broken for a few hours. In the heart of winter, the snow gave something rare: stillness, softness, a hush the world so rarely allows. The frost had always belonged outside, on fences, on fields, on the edges of wells and along the rims of water buckets. But then came the mornings when it crept indoors. A tea first. It was just a sheen, a whisper of white on the window's edge. Beautiful, almost, like lace made by the night. But then it thickened, spread, and before long, the house held ice as if it had invited it in. The windows glazed over from within, thin frost patterns blooming like wildflowers caught mid-bloom. Children traced them with fingernails, leaving trails that melted almost as soon as they appeared. Breath hung in the air, soft and slow, like steam from a kettle too tired to whistle. You could see it, the cold. It no longer hid. It gathered on the walls, turned straw to glass beneath the bed, froze the edges of blankets still warm at their center. A wooden bowl left on the table overnight had a skin of ice across the top. Water buckets inside the house had to be cracked before use. Even the chamber pot gave off steam when used, a strange sort of comfort that, they said, the cold came in through the floor, rose from the earth, one splinter at a time. It found its way through gaps in the stone, climbed up legs, and settled behind the spine. And one opened the door, unless they had to. Not out of laziness, out of self-preservation. Because opening the door meant letting the cold touch everything. You'd spent all night protecting. They added more layers. Blankets, cloaks, even old rugs, nailed to walls. But ice doesn't need permission. It slides through silence. It grows where breath lingers. One morning, a mother touched the wall beside her bed and felt it bite back. Not just cold, but hard. Her palm came away wet. She looked at her child sleeping beside her, and for a moment, the world felt far too fragile. Bread hardened overnight. Milk froze in the pail. A thin film of ice formed across the top of the stew pot. Though it had been set close to the fire, even the fire seemed quieter. Like it was trying not to upset the frost. Like it too had learned to burn smaller, slower, more carefully. When people spoke, they spoke less. Words left the mouth warm, but vanished too quickly to leave meaning. So they saved them. Used gestures, eyes, touch. You learned to listen to the house, to know which creaks were ordinary and which were warnings. A timber, groaning in the night. A drip frozen midair, dangling from a thatch to cold to thaw. The cold made its own art. Icicles inside the loft. Hoarfrost along the inside edge of a wooden door. Even the inside of a kettle or a thin silver ruff, there was beauty in it. If you were well fed, well covered, and still young enough to be curious. But for most, it was simply one more thing to bear. The morning routine shifted. You woke by shivering. You dressed by layers. And before anything else, before bread, before words, you fed the fire, hands red from cold, wrapped around mugs. That steamed too briefly. You didn't drink quickly because it was hot. You drank quickly because it wouldn't stay that way. On especially cruel days, the ice crept across the inside of the shutter hinges. So even when they wanted to open them, they couldn't. The world sealed them in. And they sat there, waiting for warmth like it was a guest who'd forgotten to arrive. Still, they carried on. A girl rubbed her hands together so often they cracked, and she didn't cry about it. A father split wood with fingers that barely moved. A mother warmed a rock in the hearth and tucked it into her child's blanket like a secret gift. They didn't speak of the cold inside the house. There was no need. Everyone felt it. Everyone lived beside it, but sometimes someone would mention spring not as a certainty, but as a kind of spell. Won't be long now, they'd murmur, though no one could say how long. Though the frost still formed on the table, though the morning bread cracked like glass, and somehow that helped. That small, stubborn hope, that insistence that ice could not own everything. Not forever, because in every corner touched by frost, there was also resistance. A steaming bowl, a flickering candle, a breath that still rose and fell. The ice inside the house was not a defeat. It was a reminder. That warmth, though fragile, still fought back, that even in the coldest room, someone still stirred the fire. Someone still whispered a story. Someone still reached out and pulled the blanket a little tighter, and in that act quiet, unseen, they said to the cold, "You are here. But so are we." Life didn't pause for winter, not even when it should have. People still fell in love, and people still died. The snow didn't care about the calendar. It came whether there was bread in the oven or a body in the bed, whether you were dressing for vows or mourning in black. Weddings in winter were strange things, stripped bare of flowers, of dancing, of the warm laughter that carried late into summer evenings. But still they happened, because love, too, needed shelter, because sometimes two people simply couldn't wait for spring. A winter wedding was a quiet promise, a shawl over a simple dress, boots muddy from the walk to the church, hands joined not out of joy alone, but survival. The priest's breath rose like incense in the cold nave. The vows were said quickly, more for frostbitten toes than brevity. And when the rings were exchanged, or more often, when a thread of yarn was knotted between fingers, it felt like resistance, a defiance of the cold. The feast, if there was one, was modest. Stew instead of meat pies, bread cut thin to stretch for everyone. Maybe one small bottle of ale passed from hand to hand like a blessing. Laughter was quieter, dancing shorter, but the joy was no less real. In fact, it was stronger, the kind forged in hardship, not luxury. A bride might wear her mother's cloak. A groom might gift his new wife a pair of wool mittens, stitched by his own shaking fingers. And when they returned to the cottage, two beds pushed into one, fire built high, the cold still seeped in. But so did something else, something warm, something new. But not all gatherings were for joy. Winter also brought the kind of silence that didn't end at nightfall, the kind of stillness that meant the cough had grown worse, the fever hadn't broken, the old man hadn't stirred. Death came faster in winter, not because it tried harder, just because everything else was tired. A child who coughed too long, an elder whose bones gave up their last fight, a mother who bled too much, too far from help. When someone died, the house responded. The fire was tended less. The talking stopped. A blanket was draped over the body, not out of respect, but to keep the cold from claiming it too soon. And then came the problem no one wanted to speak of. The ground, frozen solid, harder than grief, more unyielding than sorrow. Digging a grave in winter was a task for the strongest, and even they paused more than usual. Their breath rose in clouds. Their hands blistered through gloves. The spade rang out each time it struck frost. Sometimes the hole was not finished in a day. Sometimes the body had to wait. Wrapped, guarded, prayed over again and again, not out of superstition, but out of love, and when the time came to carry them to the earth, the path was slow. Snow underfoot. Shadows long and blue across the fields. No music. Just footsteps. Just breath, a simple box, if they had the wood. A shroud, if they didn't. Laid into frozen soil as gently as strength allowed. No speeches. Just a glance to the sky. Just a murmured name, but even in grief there was warmth. In the hands that helped lower the body. In the bread shared after, around the fire, in quiet memory. In the candle lit that night, left to burn long after everyone had gone to bed, because winter weddings and winter deaths were not opposites. They were both reminders that life insists. That warmth, though rare, is not lost. In the same room where someone died, someone might be born a month later. In the same church that echoed with tears, laughter would rise come spring, and the snow would forget what it had covered. But the people wouldn't. They remembered the way her hand trembled when she said, "I do." They remembered the way he looked in the candlelight, gone but not yet cold. They remembered that even in the harshest season, love still found a way in. And so did grief. And so did grace. Winter did not wait for permission. But neither did they. They buried. They married. They lit fires, not just to survive, but to witness, because even beneath gray skies, life continued. And that in the deepest. Months was everything. Most of the village slept. Curled beneath wool, beneath straw, beneath breath that clouded the air and quickly vanished. But not everyone slept. There was always someone who stayed awake, not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. They were the watchers, the ones who listened when the others dreamed, who stirred the fire just enough to keep it from dying, but not enough to wake the room. Sometimes it was the mother of a newborn, eyes heavy, arms aching. Sometimes it was the old man who couldn't find sleep, bones too full of memory. Sometimes it was a boy sent to keep wolves from the goats, clutching a dull blade and a braver face than he felt. The night in winter was long, longer than the body preferred. It stretched like shadow, wider than thought, quieter than comfort, and in that darkness, sounds mattered. A pop in the wood, a creak above the door, a low moan from outside that might have been wind or not. The night watchers didn't speak. There was no one to hear, but they listened. To the house, to the fire, to the slow breathing of those who could still find dreams. They sat near the hearth, wrapped in every layer they owned, sometimes with a mug of something warm, held close, more for the feel than the taste. The candle burned low beside them, flame swaying with every draft. Even light in winter seemed unsure of itself. A child might whimper in sleep, and a watcher would lean close, press a hand gently to the brow, adjust the blanket with care practiced over countless nights. No one would remember it in the morning, but that didn't matter. Kindness wasn't kept for memory. It was kept for need. Some watched because they feared what might come. Illness, intruders, a fire gone cold. Others watched simply because they could not sleep. Too much hunger in the belly, too many thoughts in the chest. A widow might sit in the corner, unmoving, eyes open, not from grief alone, but from the strange feeling of being both in and out of time. The house that once breathed beside her now snored without her. So she watched, and outside, the cold moved like a tide, pressing in through the walls, testing the shutters, rattling the latch just enough to be heard. The animals felt it too. The goats stirred. The chickens shifted. Even the dog let out a soft growl, not of warning, just recognition. Sometimes the watcher stepped outside, wrapped tight, boots crunching the frost. Just to see that the world was still there. The sky overhead was a black so deep it seemed to breathe. Stars like nails hammered into cold wood. Breath rose fast and vanished. But for a moment, the cold was beautiful. A barn door checked. A bundle of hay tossed to a quiet animal. A glance at the tree line, shadowed and silent, then back. Inside, where warmth waited not loud, but loyal. Where the fire needed one more stir, one more log, one more whispered reassurance that it would last the night. Sometimes a watcher fell asleep where they sat, head tilted, hands curled in their lap, the kind of sleep that comes after resisting too long. And someone else would rise, slow and quiet, and take their place because the house remembered. And someone always watched. It wasn't noble. It wasn't heroic. It was just what people did when others depended on them. The watchers were not always thanked, but they were felt. In the steadiness of the fire, in the untouched corners of the room, in the safety that allowed others to sleep through the coldest stretch of night, and when the first gray of dawn crept in soft, like a new thought the watchers exhaled. They had made it through, not with speeches, not with swords, but with a stool, a shawl, a slow heart that stayed beating while the rest of the world rested, and as they stirred the morning's first pot, as they pressed the coals back into flame, they did not brag. They only smiled because there is a quiet pride in being the one who stayed awake. Sleep in winter was not always soft. It came slow, and it came hard, wrestled from aching limbs, growling bellies, and the constant whisper of wind against the shutter. But when it did come, it came like a weight, heavy, immovable. The cold changed how they slept. It made them smaller, curled, hunched, layers pulled so tight they became part of the body. They slept in clusters, children tangled like kittens, lovers back to back, elders wrapped in solitude in thick wool, blankets rustled, straw creaked. A single cough echoed longer than it should, but beneath all that, they dreamed, not in the way poets described no flight, no golden fields, no great romances. Winter dreams were simpler. Hunger shaped them. So did memory. They dreamed of warmth, a bowl of thick stew, steam curling in a shaft of morning light, a walk through summer grass, bare feet brushing green, the weight of sun on skin not searing, just present, a warm hand reaching for theirs without need. The children dreamed. In color. Colors they barely remembered, the blue of sky without frost, the yellow of bees, the orange of berries in June. They dreamed of chasing, of finding, of growing tall. Their parents dreamed of enough. Enough food, enough wood, enough days without a funeral. They didn't dream big, just better. And the elders? They dreamed backward. Of weddings, of first loves, of the way their mother once pulled a blanket over their shoulder and whispered nothing, just tucked and left. That was enough. Dreams, like sleep, didn't last long. The cold was a jealous thing. It tugged at toes. It crawled down necklines. It shook them awake, gently at first, then with insistence. Sometimes they woke crying, not from fear, but from return, from the loss of that warm loaf, that glowing sun, that remembered voice. And they'd lie there, eyes open in the dark, staring at nothing, letting the dream fade slowly, letting the ache settle. Others woke silently, with a start, with a breath caught in their throat, as if they'd fallen from somewhere soft into something sharp. There were nights when no one dreamed. Nights, too. Cold, too loud with wind, too long with silence. Those nights were blank, a stretch of black between dusk and dawn. But they were rare, because even in the coldest rooms, Even with no bread left and no fire strong enough, the mind still wandered, still reached, still made a place where things were gentle and possible, a place where the goat didn't die, where the baby lived, where spring came early and stayed longer than usual. Sometimes they told each other their dreams. A girl might whisper in the early morning, "I saw a lake with no ice." A boy might say, "I was in a bed so soft, I sank like bread in broth," and the others would nod, because they had been there too. Somewhere close, in their own sleep, they didn't question the dreams, didn't try to explain them. Dreams were a kind of warmth the world couldn't take away. Private hearths that burned in silence, they were also warnings. A fevered child dreamed strange things, talked in sleep, named people who weren't there, and sometimes woke quieter than before. You listened to those dreams differently. A mother might hold her child tighter, even after waking. A father might tend the fire twice before lying down again, because dreams knew things the waking world tried to forget, and still they came. Soft as snow, brief as candlelight, they slipped in beside the cold, curling into minds that didn't want them but needed them, and when morning came gray, stiff and silent, the dreams left slowly, caught in the folds of the blanket, stuck behind the eyes for a few minutes longer, enough to carry through breakfast, enough to believe, just a little, that today might not be as long. Sleep was survival. Dreams were grace, and even in the coldest nights, they found each other. Somewhere between silence and straw, between coughs and firelight, the dream came, and was held, and was kept, until it was needed again. Some nights, the wind didn't whisper. It roared. It clawed at the shutters, like something angry. It howled down chimneys and rattled doors with the persistence of a forgotten debt. It found every crack, every seam, every weakness in the home, and reminded you that outside was always waiting. People said the wind had voices, that if you listened closely, you could hear it speak not in words, but in warnings. Long, low moans that curled through the beams. Short, sharp whistles that sliced through the thatch. Children huddled deeper into blankets. Even grown men looked at the latch twice before trusting it would hold. No one liked to admit it, but when the wind howled, it stirred something ancient. Not just fear, but inside the fire was built higher. Not for cheer, for defense. The flames sputtered in protest each time. The wind pressed hard against the walls. And still, the house held just. Candles trembled in their holders. Shadows jerked across the floor. The roof creaked like an old man's knees, like a ship at sea. And the people stayed still because there was nothing else to do. They listened to the latch twitching in its frame, to the distant snap of a branch, to the way the goat bleated once sharply, then stopped. The wind turned familiar things into strangers. The shed out back, now groaning like it wanted to move. The clothesline flapping with urgency. The trees, stripped bare, now seemed alive and angry, and inside, the house became smaller. Rooms that once felt wide now closed in. The straw bed seemed thinner. The walls seemed thinner. Even the air, thick with smoke and breath, felt too little. And no one told stories when the wind howled. No one sang. Even the children knew not to speak. They clung to what was warm and waited. Waited for the sound to shift, for the roar to dull, for the house to exhale, but the wind didn't always stop. Not quickly. It circled for hours, sometimes days. Like a wolf that couldn't decide whether to strike or move on, and every hour it stayed, something changed. Hope got quieter. Chores got heavier. Even light felt fragile. One night, the wind tore a shutter loose. It slammed against the wall like a drumbeat. And in that moment, The house became a mouth open to winter. Someone jumped up, blanket still, wrapped around their shoulders and tied it back down. Not with skill, with urgency, with fingers stiff and a face set like stone. They didn't speak after. They just went back to their place near the fire, hands shaking not from cold, but from memory. The wind didn't like doors that opened. Some said it was the ghosts. Others, the saints testing the faithful. But most simply knew the wind was what came when the cold wanted to be felt more deeply. It wasn't just sound. It was presence. It didn't knock politely. It demanded, and somehow, that demand united them. A family that had quarreled all day would sit closer that night. The arguments melted. The silence became shared. One would pass the mug. Another would tuck the blanket tighter. A child would find a hand and hold it, not asking permission. And no one pulled away, because when the wind howled, everything else became small. By morning, if morning came, the world outside looked different. Branches on the ground. Drifts of snow pushed up like waves against the doors. Sometimes a chicken gone. Sometimes just feathers, and inside, the house exhaled. Not loudly, it didn't dare, but deeply. Someone would speak first. A soft curse, a short laugh, a whispered, still here, and they were still there. Still together. Still held fast by wood and stone, and love too quiet to brag. The wind had come, had raged, had passed, and the house, bruised but unbroken, had stood its ground. There was pride in that. Not loud, not showy, but felt. In the way. The fire was built again without complaint. In the way, someone swept the floor with care. In the way, the children, now free to speak, didn't because they remembered. The howl, the weight, the way even silence had felt sacred when the wind had tried to take it all away. The house did not hum with industry in winter. It creaked. It breathed. And at the center of its breath, quiet and constant, was the women's work. It was not loud, not praised, not even always noticed. But it was there in the flick of thread, in the scrape of a blade, in the stir of the pot that never quite boiled from the first frost to the final thaw. The women moved through the home like ghosts with purpose. Scarves tied tight, sleeves pushed back, hands raw, red, and never still, spinning wool in corners with a rhythm older than memory, churning butter with an elbow rhythm learned from mothers now buried under frozen soil, scraping tallow from cracked pans to make one more candle stub. It wasn't just survival. It was choreography. They were not thanked. They were not asked. They simply did. A girl barely old enough to count might mend a stocking, pricking her fingers with every other stitch. Her mother would not scold, only nod. Because every stitch, even clumsy, meant one less tear open to the cold, the women knew how to stretch. Not arms, not legs, but time. A single loaf into 3 meals. A single onion into 5 stews. A candle into a week. Their math was made in hunger and heat. What to use now? What to save? What to pretend was still enough? They patched every corner. Torn blankets. Worn sleeves. Loose floorboards stuffed with rags to keep out the wind. They held the home together not with nails, but with thread. With salt. With stories, they cooked with what was left. Boiled bones until they wept marrow. Steeped old herbs into new remedies. Turned yesterday's stale bread into tonight's warm pudding, if it could be called that, and through it all, they watched, they noticed when a cough deepened, when a child's laughter turned brittle, when the fire was burning too fast, or too quiet. They didn't ask for help. They offered it in silence, a mug placed near a tired hand. A shawl pulled higher on someone's shoulder. A squeeze of the arm, brief and wordless, while passing by, even in grief. Their hands moved. They laid out the dead, washed the bodies with cloth and warmth, lit the candle, closed the door, and then they returned to the stew. Because everyone else still needed to eat, they taught without teaching. A daughter learned to braid bread by watching, learned to tie knots by untying her mother's work, learned the best way to dry herbs without losing their scent, not with lessons, with repetition. There, voices did not fill the room, but they filled the gaps between firewood and sleep, between hunger and hope. At tea night, they rubbed salve into cracked hands and didn't wince, because tomorrow the churn would need turning again. The wool would still need spinning. The fire would still wait for their breath to rise. They rarely slept through the night. A child cried. A draft found a new way in. The pot bubbled over. A noise outside needed checking. They rose before the sun, slept after the fire had dimmed, dreamed only of what might still be done. The men labored to outside, in the fields, in the woods. But winter pushed women inward, into the bone of the house, where the quiet was heaviest. And it was there that they worked, unseen sometimes. One of them would pause, sit at the table, stare at the fire, rub her temples and say nothing, that silence spoke louder than any cry, and the others would understand, would step in without comment, because no one could afford to break. Not really, even joy had its place. Laughter between sisters while stitching a torn hem. A hum carried through the house like smoke, steady and low. A baby's giggle at the way a spoon tapped against the bowl. The work never ended. But neither did the love. It was not sweet, not tender. It was durable, like the wool they spun, like the homes they kept upright with nothing but their backs and hands. And when the spring came, it would seem sudden, but the women would know. They had seen the signs days before, in the drip of the roof, in the looseness of the mud, in the way their shoulders finally lowered, even just an inch. But until then, they worked, in corners, in shadows, in silence, not for glory, not even for thanks, but because someone had to, and they always did. There were days when your own fire wasn't enough. The coals were too cold, the wood too wet, or your hands too tired to make it right again. The room stayed gray. Your breath lingered in front of your face longer than it should. And you knew today you'd need warmth from somewhere else. So you borrowed it, not in words, rarely in requests, but in glances, in footsteps across snow, in the soft knock at a neighbor's door. Borrowed warmth came in many forms. A bowl of stew handed over without comment, a blanket laid on your shoulders while you spoke of nothing. A child sent to fetch kindling, not because you asked, because someone noticed. The village was built on such exchanges. Not coins, not contracts, but small, silent moments of giving what you could. When you could, one morning, a woman rose to find her fire out. Not a single ember glowed. She stood still for a while, staring at the ash, thinking. Then, without a word, she wrapped herself in her husband's old cloak and walked to her sister's door. The sister didn't say anything, just stepped aside and let her in. They stood by the hearth together. The older woman handed her a cup of warm water. Not tea, not broth, just warm. That was enough. Sometimes it was a man returning from the woods with more than he needed. He'd leave a bundle of kindling by a neighbor's steps. Not knock, not wait. Just leave it there like a whispered blessing. Sometimes it was the midwife who brought a wool scarf for the new mother. Not because she had to, Because she remembered what it was like to shiver alone. Children shared warmth without realizing it, pressed together on benches, curled beneath shared blankets, hands clasped in sleep like vines growing toward light, and, when one was sick, the others gave up their share of bread without being told. Borrowed warmth wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was a story told in a trembling voice, a memory of spring, a song hummed while kneading dough, loud enough for the neighbor to hear, a laugh that caught fire and lit 2 houses instead of 1 on the darkest days when the sky gave no color and the wind kept coming. Borrowed warmth meant survival. It meant not letting pride freeze your voice. It meant letting someone else pour the ale, stir the pot, light the candle, and later, when your fire burned again, you gave it back. Not directly, not in equal measure, but in your own way, a pair of mittens knitted for the boy next door, a hot stone wrapped in cloth and left for the elder who lived alone, a loaf of bread shaped just a little sweeter than usual, handed off with a shrug. And a one kept track. No one needed to. Because in winter, everything was shared, even the silence, and somehow, that made it warmer, there were houses where the fire never seemed to fail. Not because they had more, but because they gave more. People gravitated there. Not like moths. More like tired travelers who knew where the road was kindest. They arrived not for handouts, but for heat that didn't demand explanation, for space near the hearth, for a chair pulled close, for a moment to breathe. That was borrowed warmth. 2, a place held for you until you could stand again, and when death came as it did, borrowed warmth carried on. In the shared meals after the burial, in the hands that washed the clothes, in the fire tended by someone else while the grieving forgot how to move, because grief is cold. So cold. And warmth once borrowed is the only thing that softens it even. The church held borrowed heat. People sat shoulder to shoulder, not out of piety alone, but because stone walls held cold longer than wood. And everybody present was a kind of coal. Even God in winter was shared. At night, as the winds rose and the frost clawed at the walls, the warmth inside wasn't always yours. It was theirs. His. Hers. Yours now, only because someone had chosen to give it, and in that giving, you remembered, the cold could not take everything. Not while kindness remained. Not while the fire was passed hand to hand, breath to breath, borrowed warmth quiet. Unseen was the true hearth of the village, and it never went out. It didn't happen all at once. The thaw never did. There was no grand moment, no trumpet from the sky, no sudden warmth that swept away the frost like a broom across the floor. It started small. So small, many didn't believe it at first. A drip. Soft, steady, rhythmic. Water sliding from the eaves, slow as honey, carving a narrow path down the side of the house. The children noticed it first. Not because they were wiser, but because they were looking. They pointed to the icicle, now shrinking, to the snow near the fence that seemed to sag, as if it had given up its stubbornness. Someone stepped outside without a cloak. Just for a minute. Just to feel the air. It wasn't warm, not yet, but it was different. Less sharp, less cruel. Inside, the fire burned the same. The stew tasted the same. But the light was changing. It came earlier now, lingered a little longer on the far wall of the cottage. The shadows softened. The corners no longer felt quite so tight. One morning, a patch of earth appeared near the doorway. Brown, damp, unremarkable, and yet it drew a crowd. 2 children, a dog. Even the old man stood in the threshold, squinting as though seeing a memory. It smelled like nothing, but also like everything, like what had been missing. The snow still lay thick across the fields, still buried the tools, still covered the graves dug deep in January. But the edge had dulled. You could feel it in your bones, in the way you moved through the house, in the way you opened the door without flinching. Bird song returned in pieces. One chirp, then another, days later. A hesitant duet. Music made of memory and instinct. The animals stirred differently. The goat stamped her hooves more often. The chickens pecked at the ground with something like hope. The dog lifted its nose and sniffed long, as if recognizing a scent it hadn't smelled since it was young. Inside, the women began to sort the linens. Not to use, not yet, but to see what might last another season. The wool was folded differently. The bread was baked with less caution. Men sharpened tools not for firewood, but for earth. Not because the ground was ready, but because they were. Their hands remembered there was still cold. Still nights when the wind returned like a story half told. Still mornings with frost along the sill, but something had shifted. The cold no longer ruled. It lingered. Children played further from the house. Their laughter sounded different rounder, fuller, less tucked beneath their breath. They returned with red cheeks and muddy boots and news of a bird's nest on the fence. Post, the kindling pile once guarded like gold, was now used more freely. The fire grew not because they needed it, but because they wanted it. For light, for comfort, a mother stepped outside and closed her eyes. The sun touched her face. She said nothing, but her shoulders lowered. Even grief loosened its grip. The candle on the table still burned for the one they'd lost, but now it was joined by a sprig of something green, moss maybe, or lichen. Life returning not with a roar, but with a whisper. The village, once silent, hummed again, with brooms brushing stoops, with buckets splashing, with door hinges creaking more often. Hope was not a word they used much, but they felt it dot in the way they opened windows for just a moment, in the way they let the stew cook a little longer, not out of need, but pleasure, in the way they paused at the threshold, just to watch the world drip back into motion. Spring had not come, but it had sent a letter, and they read it in every melting inch. They didn't rush. They didn't celebrate. Winter had taught them caution, but also patience. So they moved gently into the thaw, savoring each sign, each note of birdsong, each drop of water, each moment. The sky forgot to be gray, because the thaw was not just a change in weather. It was a return to color, to sound, to self. And after a season of stillness that was more than enough, spring always came eventually. The frost melted. The birds returned. The soil softened beneath tired boots. But some cold never left. It lingered long after the snow had disappeared from the fields. It stayed in the joints of the old man who hadn't stretched fully since December, in the fingertips of the weaver, who could no longer feel the thread like she used to, in the silence around a chair that hadn't been filled since Candlemas. This was not the cold you could warm away. Not with fire. Not with wool. Not with broth or sun or time. It was the cold that made you flinch when the wind came in from the north, even in May. The kind that settled behind the ribs like regret. They called it the winter ache. Not a sickness, not a curse, just something the body remembered even when the world forgot. A man might pause while hoeing the first patch of earth, his back seized in an old pain. Just the cold, he'd mutter, and no one would question him. A woman might shiver while hanging the laundry, even though the sun was bright. She'd rub her arms and smile anyway, because the cold wasn't in the air. It was in her. Children recovered faster. Their bones forgot. Their breath came easier, but they carried the stories. Of the night, the wind howled. Of the morning, they found frost inside the bucket. Of the time their sister gave them the last piece of bread and didn't ask for any in return, the cold stayed in memory. It clung to the walls of the cottage. It lived in the places not cleaned because they still held the smell of winter smoke. Ash, damp wool, even joy or a cloak for a while. Laughter returned, but softer. Feet ran again, but more carefully. The songs sung at dusk carried a certain quiet beneath the melody. Spring flowers grew outside the graves that winter had filled. And still the cold lingered there too. Not in temperature but in tone. A glance held too long. A word left unsaid. A space at the table set for no one. Some people never spoke of the winter. They buried it as surely as they buried the firewood. Stack. Let it lie, deep and quiet, in the place where difficult seasons go. Others could not stop speaking of it. Of the cold, yes, but more than that. Of how they endured. Of how she stayed awake all night when the roof threatened to fall. Of how he gave up his coat so the child could sleep warm, not bragging. Just remembering, because remembering was how they healed. They knew the sun would rise again. That it already had. That seeds would sprout and goats would kid, and the days would stretch like arms reaching wide, but they also knew that winter had marked them dot in ways small and silent. In a limp, in a softened voice, in a look that lingered on a patch of sky, as if wondering whether it might turn again, and maybe that was the truth of it, that we never quite leave the cold behind. We carry it forward in scar and story, in ache and gratitude, because the cold that stayed also taught them something. It taught them that warmth was not a thing, not a fire, not a coat, not a bowl of stew. It was people. It was presence. It was someone reaching out without being asked. Someone who held your name when you couldn't say it yourself. Someone who sat with you when the wind blew and didn't tell you to be brave, just stayed. The cold had not been kind, but it had made kindness more visible. And so, even as the days grew longer and the air sweetened, they moved more slowly, held hands a little longer, let the fire burn just a little past need, because some cold still lingered in the corners of their hearts. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was all right. It reminded them that they had lived through something, that they had endured, that they had made it not in spite of the cold, but alongside it, and the cold, in turn, had made them softer, quieter, stronger. So when spring fully arrived, they stepped into it gently, not with triumph, with tenderness, knowing that even if winter had left the earth, it had left something behind in them, and that was something worth carrying. There are kinds of warmth the fire can't give. Not the glow from embers, not the heat of stew, not the sun through a south-facing window. No, the warmth that mattered most in those long medieval winters came from quieter places, from eyes meeting across a room where no one had spoken for hours, from a hand brushed against another while reaching for the same loaf, from the silence after grief not empty, but held. This warmth wasn't loud. It didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly like the steam from a shallow bowl, like the curl of smoke rising from a single damp log, finally catching flame. It lived in the smallest gestures, a mother wrapping her child in the last layer of wool, even if it left her shivering. A neighbor leaving bread by a door with no knock, no note. A boy climbing out of bed to feed the fire without being asked. It lived in waiting, in watching, in listening. It was the warmth of presence, of being with someone really with them. In the hardest stretch of the year, you could see it in the way they moved through their days. Not with cheer, not with despair, but with something in between, something like grace, Each action carried intention. Each chore done not just for survival, but for each other. A room didn't need to be bright to feel safe. A meal didn't need to be full to be shared. A home didn't need to be warm to be welcoming, it just needed to be open, and so they opened. To each other.